Hello guys and gals, and this is part 8. Let me check my notes. Part 8 of our reading of Guinevere by Sharan Newman. Now, as always, we're going to go over the copyright information. Book is copyright 1981 by Sharan Newman. Also want to point out this book is still for sale at most booksellers. Mainly online booksellers, probably. Or maybe in ebook form. So is the sequel, the Chessboard Queen, and the final book in this trilogy, Guinevere Evermore. So make sure you check those out. This book is always worth a read. It's a wonderful book. Anyways, in the last episode, we learned out more about Guinevere's routine down at the Hermitage with Gaia and Timon. We also learned the backstory of Gaia, and so yeah. Now, I believe the last paragraph or few that we read was basically how life was progressing on the compound without Guinevere there. And I'm gonna unplug that for now. Okay. Anyways, so here we go. Gwendolyn shuddered, but bore all their boorishness with dignity and apparent unconcern. Such was the power of her name and station, not to mention her own regal appearance, that no one ever quite got out of hand. Matthew and John were more than slightly embarrassed by their comrades' manners. It was strange how differently these men appeared in their home. There were many hunting trips, and during the breaks in these, the brothers tried to make it clear to the men that even with the drought, baths could be provided for those who wished to follow the old customs. There was a lot of ribaldry connected with the suggestion, but most of the soldiers took the hint. They mocked, but they admitted too that they were powerfully awed by the glimpse of Roman life. It gave them new insight into what they might have if the invaders were ever completely ousted from Britain. It had been planned that way by Merlin, of course. He and Arthur had discussed it after they came. A few weeks of civilized life would give them all something to imagine for themselves. Leodegrance had sighed when they explained it, but resigned himself to the inconvenience in the name of Rome. So the hordes of soldiers came to the villa during the day. They hunted in the forest. It was mostly for sport, mostly for sport and to keep themselves occupied, but there was no denying that the game they brought back was vital to keep them, all fed. Not all the sheep and cattle on the place could have satisfied those carnivores. At night, they feasted in the great dining room, or tables were set up in the atrium under the stars to make more room. Gwendolyn said to save spending the next day mopping, she thought. Mark was the only one of the brothers who preferred to stay behind when the others rode off. At first, he explained that it was going to help oversee the land and free his father for pleasure. But later, he confided to Arthur that he had simply had enough of seeing things die. I'm home now, he sighed, and I want to think of nothing but food and a clean bed, and how nicely little Rihanna has grown since I had last seen her. It seems a pity she's almost 16 now. Soon her parents will decide she's ready for marriage and send for her. Then she'll have to go back up into the mountains and live in a leaky stone house with her fine, strong herdsman husband. And all her beauty and grace will be wasted unless a wandering monk should stop by, or a merchant come to bid for their horses and wool. I have no doubt that she will be supremely happy. Arthur smiled at his friend. They sat alone on the ground, leaning against an old stable wall. The stone was still warm from the sun, although it was well past midnight. The roistering hunters had all long since staggered to their beds, or lay curled where they had passed out under the tables. But Arthur was restless, and not as drunk as his men. He had gone wandering and found Mark in the stable. He was feeling talkative, and Arthur was content to let him ramble on, hearing little of what he said. They were facing the court, and the lamps were still lit in a few of the windows. Arthur gazed at the scene hungrily. The house alone was more than he had imagined. It was a piece of art unto itself. Mosaics on all the floors, the murals on the walls, statues carved into the lintels and columns, and windows, real glass windows of a cool, rippling green that made the room inside seem mystical and soothing. And Mark called it home. He had never known any other. Arthur remembered his fostering place. It was in the north, too near the sea. It was cold and damp all year round. It was only an old fort adapted for family living. The rooms were tiny, originally intended for storage or as watchtowers. The walls were thick stone with narrow slits in them to not admit light but to fire through at attackers. When the wind was strong, they would be covered with oiled skins, and then they would be no light at all. The walls were smeared with smoke and grease, and the entire household slept together for warmth. Cleanliness wasn't a word in his vocabulary until he met Merlin. He stared angrily at his hands, big, rough, clumsy. He wondered if the lady Gwynlyn had cringed inside when she had touched them in greeting. He felt terribly uncomfortable and out of place in this ordered, cultured world, but his whole heart longed to be a part of it, to live like a gentleman, a Roman citizen, although he was rather vague on just what those terms entailed. To live in a place like that and feel as though one belonged there, he laughed bitterly at himself. He knew what he was. For all Merlin's teachings, he was a soldier, a man who could make other men follow him into battle. When the battle ended, he was no more. He was no one again, a man with no family, no station, no place in the cosmos, certainly no place in a society where everyone was related and every man knew his cousins to the 7th degree. He pressed his lips together tightly and tried to pay attention to what Mark was saying. Actually, Arthur was being too hard on himself. He had made a very strong and favorable impression on Leodegrance and Gwynlyn. Even before he spoke, they were pleased with his air of quiet control, but their prejudice showed in their failure to approve of him completely until they had heard his voice. Under Merlin's careful training, his Latin was pure and clear. He knew the correct phrases, and when he used them, although he still had a hard time recognizing words when they were written down, for all his rough, barbaric appearance, they decided that he was acceptable as a general for their sons. In their minds, it was but a small transition from that to leading the country. Everything he said and did on his visit only confirmed this opinion. And although she didn't admit it, there was a lonely, lost look about him that touched Gwynlyn's heart and made her want to mother him, as she did her own children. "Who is he?" she asked Merlin one night, as they sat alone on her private veranda. You know who he is." Sorry about that. "Who is he?" she asked Merlin one night, as they sat alone on her private veranda. "You know who he is. You've said so." Merlin nodded. "He is a boy with a great gift for making other people believe in him, and a certain talent for military strategy. He hasn't done much else yet. He's not far over 20, you know. He looks younger," she commented. "I suppose it's because he's so fair. That mop of red hair and all those freckles make him look like a boy. He can't be shaving yet. His body still outtraces itself, all arms and legs and nose. Mark still has that colt-like appearance, and he's only 17. But I didn't ask you his age or talents. I want to know where he comes from, who his family is. You have hinted mysteriously to many people that you know his parentage, but won't reveal it. Is there something shameful about it? Is Arthur likely to go mad in a full moon? I'll not believe you if you say his father was a peasant or a slave. Crude as he is, there's good blood there, I'm certain." Merlin frowned and answered bitterly, "You're wrong, Gwynlyn. His father was a slave. the worst kind, a slave to himself, to his own base desires. He was full of uncontrolled temper and lust. They were his master, and they overcame him in the end. He stopped suddenly. He had said too much. He cursed himself. Gwendolen was not a simple-minded country wife. What might be obscure to most people would be clear as crystal to her. Raised as she was in the eye of the storm, surrounded by politics and intrigue, too late he realized what good cause she had for knowing of a man who allowed his body to control his reason. He studied her carefully in the candlelight. Her face was closed. She remembered. In the cool night, she could still smell the rancid wine on his breath and the hot, clumsy hands pawing at her robes. She shuddered. "By whom?" she asked sharply. Merlin saw there was no prevaricating. Actually, he was relieved to be able to tell someone he had feared he might die before it was time to reveal the secret, and that could not be permitted. His own legal wife, he said. "I can't believe that. There was a 6-month child born soon after the marriage, but it died. Of course, they never live when they come so early. She had no others. They said it was a judgment. She believed it. Poor woman. It was a full-term infant. I received him, still wet from the mother, the birth bloodstains on his fingernails, and rode out with him at once. I found a wet nurse and kept him with me 3 months. When I was sure he would live, I sent him to Ector for fostering. It was true then. There were rumors even at the time that Uther had gone to Tintagel the night that Gorlias died and forced himself upon Igraine. I never understood why she consented to marry him. I thought it was out of fear, but she was carrying his child even then." His voice intensified in anger. "He raped her with her husband's murder on his soul, and you convinced it, and you connived it for him." He shrank from her. "It had to be, Gwynlyn. It was an evil piece of business, and it sickened me, even then. Though I was as young then as Arthur is now, and didn't realize what she must have suffered. But that is the way it was ordained, and I could only guide the events, even as I must do now." "Why did you never let anyone know the child lived?" She didn't doubt his story. Though she understood nothing of the burden of prophecy, she never disbelieved anything he said. You know what it was like after Uther died. The man had many enemies among his own followers and among the Saxons. The babe was born too early. There would always be doubt about his parentage, but even if his legitimacy was proven, there were 20 factions that would have been happy to see him dead. I thought it better to let him earn his kingdom. I've watched over him as much as I could, taught him, taken him with me when I was able. I've tested him too. He has his mother's character and sense of honor, though he has his father's looks. He'll make though he has his father's look. Okay, I see. He will make a good man and a just ruler. Still, we don't know if there will be anything left of him to rule. Left for him to rule. And there are many yet who would refuse to follow him, knowing whose son he is. You cringed yourself, but remember, Gwendolyn, dear cousin, the boy doesn't know himself. He thinks he is Norman, and as that he can be both proud of what he has accomplished and humble in the splendor of nobility such as yours. You are the only one alive now who knows. Even Igraine was told the child died. Can you forget it and treat him as you have before?" She shook her head. I can't forget where he comes from, but I can try to forgive it in him. I have found no sign of Uther in the boy, apart from the hair. That would give him away, if it were known any son existed. Igraine was a gentle woman, the best of her family. She was kind to me and risked much to help. me escape from court with Leodorince, that I might be spared the horror she lived with every day. For her sake, and for her heart in him, I will be kind. Thank you, cousin, Merlin smiled. I may have made a mystery for you where none was needed. You know I could never take the straight path. Also, I feared, as you might, that he would inherit Uther's lustful nature. If that happened, I would have let Arthur remain a man-at-arms on the northern border and given up all hope for a dynasty and a united country. So, I did what I thought was best. He looked to her for approval, but her face was closed again. He felt uneasy as she smiled politely across the small table. Would you care for more wine? She asked. Automatically, he stretched his glass out for her to pour the wine. As he did so, he realized that there were people in the room behind them. Had they heard? The movement suggested that they were just passing by. Merlin sipped his wine in silence, waiting for the voices to fade, but almost immediately Mark entered the room, followed by Geraldus and lastly Arthur. Poor Arthur. Merlin sighed. He held his arms stiffly at his sides, like a soldier at inspection, but he appeared to be simply afraid of bumping into something priceless and destroying it. He stood behind the others near the door, so obviously out of place and ill at ease that Gwendolyn's heart melted. She smiled at him. Mark spoke first. We three have been thinking of going hunting for a few days by ourselves. We don't want all the howling pack around us all the time. Can you think of a diplomatic way for us to get away without offending any minor princeling and warlord in Britain? Oh, every minor princeling and warlord in Britain. You value your own company rather highly, my son. Why should anyone question you and your friends going on a private hunt? Arthur shuffled his feet. He didn't want anyone to think he had too high of an opinion of himself. Mother, Mark smiled. He knew when he was being teased. You know exactly how much of a demand we all are. Why, I can't even go to comb my horse without someone coming after me to ask my advice on a point of protocol. Now, dearest mother, will you help? She shrugged away his caress gently. She shrugged away his caress gently. Of course, there is no reason why your brothers and father cannot manage to entertain our guests for a few days. Perhaps they can be taken on a ride to the seashore. I doubt if many of our Highland-bred lords have ever walked upon a sandy beach. That very thing. Mark turned to his friend. Can't you see that Lord Column splashing in the waves and hunting for shells? From what I know of him, Merlin interjected, I would guess he spent his time examining fortifications and complaining that those appointed to keep watch for the Saxon invaders are not doing their job. Now, cousin Merlin, Mark chided, you always see the dismal side of things. Column may frolic like a naiad in the surf. I know your gloomy ways, for the way my mother was staring into her glass when we entered. I'd wager that you've been sitting here all evening foreseeing early and horrible deaths for us all. We need no more of that. Arthur, Geraldus, and I are going hunting. We have decided on it. What's more, we will not bother with boars and stags and such prosaic quarry. We are hunting mythical beasts only. What say we find a dragon or two, a griffin, or perhaps a unicorn? We may even find a satyr lost in the woods. No more nonsense about meat for the table. Pack your bags with pigeon pie. We shall go on a quest. He struck a heroic pose and drew his sword. The candlelight struck it and turned the steel to shimmering silver. Gwendolyn smiled fondly. For all his foolishness, there was something grand about him. She wished he could find a satyr. Of all her children, Mark was the only one who knew how to dream. Geraldus laughed, and Arthur at least relaxed. It's settled then, Mark said. Like the champions of old, we start at dawn, marching alone to our destiny. I do think, dear, Gwendolyn interrupted, that you might take a few others along, perhaps Kate, to care for the horses. He's been moping lately, and a quest is just what he needs. Could we take my foster brother, Seal? No, C-E-I. How would that be pronounced? K. We'll say Kate. We'll say C. With us too, Arthur blurted and turned red again. Well, all right, Mark bowed to the voice of Prudence. Perhaps I'll ask a couple of others, but don't you add anyone. Giraldus, taking you along is the same as inviting a cohort. You'd better warn your friends, Arthur, about his odd habits of waving his arms about and screaming in the air. Not that I mind. It's very entertaining, but some people might think it's annoying or assume that he is coming down with St. Vitus's dance. So still laughing and talking, the three left again and made to make plans for the morning. Merlin sighed wistfully as he saw how Arthur relaxed as soon as he was out of Gwendolyn's line of sight. He leaned back on his cushions when they were well away. Gwendolyn still studied her glass. He drew a long breath. Will you keep my secret, cousin, even from your husband? Yes, as long as you ask. I think I'd rather. Perhaps no one ever needs to know. Poor boy. There's something endearing about him. I hope his life will not be too hard. Let's not think of that now, Merlin answered. As your son so wisely said, we need no more prophecy. Good night, my dear. Good night, Gwendolyn smiled. When he had left, she let herself slip back on her couch. Memories she had blotted out from years were flooding back, those awful barbaric years after Ambrosius died, when his brother Uther was warlord of Britain. He was a tall, sinewy man with a wild, flaming beard. Gwendolyn cringed at the thought of him yet. His voice was loud even when he tried to whisper, and his whispers were vulgar and oily. His licentious tales were well known even after he married Igraine. She and Leodegrance had come to court once, just before Matthew was born. She had returned home after his birth, but came back a few months later to be with her husband. It was then she had caught his eye, her hips slender again, but her breasts full and round with milk for her son. One night he had sent her and the best tidbits from his own plate, and ordered her wine poured from his cup. The very thought of eating what he had touched revolted her. Thank God Leodegrance was wiser than poor Gorlius. He had gotten his family away at once, and yet connived with Igraine somehow to keep Uther's wrath from falling on them. Poor Igraine. No one ever believed that she had been forced to marry Uther. All her children taken from her, all her dignity, all her pride. How glad she must have been to die. Guinevere, my dearest child, I am so grateful that you're away from here now. I wish so that you could always stay there, high on the hill away from all the filth. But oh, how I miss you. She drained her glass and lay there watching the candle flame until it sputtered out. Much later, Pincerna found her there asleep. He called Leodegrance, who gently carried her to bed. Arthur, Giraldus, and Mark set off at dawn the next day. Happy and eager, they took only Kate and C and three other friends who they thought would appreciate a quest. They rode out bravely, singing at the top of their lungs. Early risers came out to wave them goodbye. They saluted one and all as they went through the gate and across the river, and their voices could be heard long after they passed from sight. 2 days later, Guinevere woke up with a feeling of intense joy. She had been dreaming again, she knew, but that feeling had never before stayed with her after she woke. This time she didn't feel as if she had been This time she didn't feel as if she had left something precious behind in her sleep, but that it had come with her into the waking world. Today, even Gaia's stern face could not depress her. She had stopped wondering about Gaia. It was Timon she loved, Timon who teased her and worked with her, and yet spoiled her much the way her family did, with affection and complete acceptance. When time came for meditation, she fairly danced her way among the trees, off to her special place. That child has no idea of the seriousness of life, Timon laughed as they watched her go. She will have, Gaia answered bitterly. She stalked back into her hut. Her meditations were spent in its darkest corner. Nature had no lure for Gaia. Guinevere had dressed herself that morning in a long white robe fastened at the shoulders with plain gold brooches. She had another chain of gold about her waist, but her feet were bare, Gaia had carefully combed her hair into tiny braids, woven about her head, but when Guinevere got to the clearing, she decided to take them all down, just to see how it would feel to run with it all streaming and floating behind her. She slipped the jade pins back on either side of her forehead, just to keep it out of her eyes. Then she ran and danced and whirled until she went around and round in a blinding gold circle. Even after she stopped, the hair continued to swing back and forth like a living thing, keeping time to her dance. It was through this golden mist that she first saw it fully. It stood on the other side of the clearing in the shade. Slowly she brushed the strands away from her face and stared. Her heart beat loudly and her body was still, as if frozen. A passerby might have thought he had come unto two statues from legend. So still were they, the country maiden and the fabulous beast. Even in the dark, beneath the trees, there was a silver glow about him. His coat was pure white, and his cloven hooves polished to a deep, shimmering purple. His mane and tail were silver, not dull gray, but as shining as the molten metal poured from the flames into the mold. Guinevere knew at once where the single strand she had found had come from, but the most awe-inspiring thing about him was the slender spiral horn rising from the center of his forehead. It was as long as her arm and reflected the light in hundreds of colors, like mother of pearl. As he shook his head, dark lavender and blues predominated, but there were flashes of every other color from orange to green. Guinevere was too intimidated by his beauty and his wildness to step closer to him. She sank slowly to the ground, her eyes never leaving his face. She was praying harder and more sincerely than she ever had in her life, that this marvel, this creature of dreams, would not run away. The unicorn bent his head as if bowing to her. He lifted it and stared at her directly. Guinevere caught her breath. 1,000 nights of longing came back to her, and she held out her arms slowly. The creature came to her and gently, humbly laid its exquisite head in her lap. There can't be any greater happiness than this, Guinevere thought. Now she knew what her dreams had foretold. She lifted her hand and caressed its shining mane. Her hair fell across it, and gold and silver mingled, floating in the light breeze. Her heart ached with the mystery and the beauty of it all. The unicorn didn't move under her touch. It was so still she wondered if it could be asleep. Timidly she looked down and carefully brushed the hair from over his eyes. The deep blue eyes caught her and held her in a visionary world. They wrapped her in emotions that she had never known and couldn't name. Sorrow and joy twined about each other, and a fierce calling swept her into his mind. We are going to pick this up. We have been reading Guinevere by Sharan Newman. Again, this book and the other books in the trilogy are still for sale. Anyways, if you like the content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.